In the early 1990s, Central Florida saw the opening of a different kind of theme park. Located right outside of Disney World, Splendid China welcomed its first guests to a park not full of roller coasters and dark rides, but scale models and cultural shows. An educational park, seeking to introduce American tourists to the customs and history of the faraway nation of China. A beautifully designed park, packed with different exhibits, but one that even before it opened, drew intense criticism, accused of whitewashing history. Not a genuine attempt at tourism, but a clear piece of propaganda, and a park that struggled to stay open during its 10 years of operation, ultimately closing and spending a further 10 years abandoned and deteriorating in Florida's tourism hotspot. An incredibly weird and largely forgotten part of Orlando's theme park history, and a story that has far more to it than just its controversy. So let's take a look back at the creation, criticism, and abandonment of what must be Florida's most controversial theme park. The story of Splendid China begins, as many tales of Florida theme parks do, in the late 1980s, this time in 1989, with a company named American Eastern International. The company was owned by Frank and Josephine Chen, a Taiwanese-American couple who had immigrated to the United States in the early 60s. Through their business, originally based on the other side of the country in Los Angeles, they'd become successful real estate developers, and had recently purchased 437 acres of land in Central Florida, on the southwestern border of Walt Disney World. The plan for the site was to construct a new housing development named Formosa Gardens, with space for 400 homes, 2 hotels, and a supermarket. But unlike a typical real estate project anywhere else in the country, the Chens would also seek to take advantage of their proximity to America's most popular theme park destination, setting aside 76 acres for the construction of their very own Central Florida theme park. A park they decided would be themed entirely around Chinese culture. That year, Josephine Chen had visited Shenzhen, China, a city near the border with Hong Kong, and had been given a tour of the soon-to-open Splendid China Miniature Scenic Spot, a model village-like tourist destination, a park containing miniature recreations of iconic buildings and sites around China, all remade in stunning detail. Impressed by the park, Josephine immediately saw an opportunity to recreate it for an American audience. Build an almost exact replica in Central Florida, right outside of Disney World, where tourists looking for more to do beyond the reaches of Disney would cause business to almost certainly boom. And importantly to Josephine, an American version of the park would have the added benefit of making Americans more familiar with what was then a still mysterious culture and country, bridging a divide and hopefully strengthening understanding between the two cultures. After 2 years of negotiations with the Shenzhen Park's owners, the state-owned China Travel Service, an agreement was finally reached to bring the park to the west. Josephine's son, George Chen, would be installed as park president, and the Chens would provide the land and be in charge of management. But the CTS would design the park themselves, provide building materials, and bring over hundreds of employees from China to staff the park once it opened. Shortly after negotiations began, the Chinese park had opened to massive success, receiving 3.5 million visitors in its first year, fully recouping the $100 million it took to build, and things were looking hopeful for its American equivalent. Construction would begin on the site in December of that year, also costing $100 million, a pretty huge amount for the location, a fifth of the cost of Disney MGM Studios built 2 years earlier. And the effort taken to build what would still be a relatively minor park in the area was nothing short of extraordinary. Foundations for the park would be laid by American contractors, but for the rest, the CTS would bring in 120 craftsmen from China, skilled in constructing, painting and sculpting the more than 60 miniature buildings and landmarks that would serve as the main focus of the park. In many cases, these were designed and assembled in China near the original location, then disassembled and shipped to Florida to be painstakingly reconstructed. 6.5 million of those bricks alone would be used to build the park's Great Wall, half a mile long, built by hand, one brick at a time, and 35,000 hand-painted figurines would be placed throughout the models to fill out the scenes. As well as the miniatures, regular-sized buildings would also be constructed with a similar traditional architectural style to house restaurants, shops, and various cultural shows, featuring dance, acrobatics, martial arts, and kite flying, planned to educate the public about Chinese customs. Newspapers at the time touted the authenticity of the place, proclaiming no mass production, no fiberglass, no coloured concrete. The project would take another 2 years to build, during which time the Chinese construction crew would live in a custom-built trailer park. 2 chefs were hired from China to cook for the workers, who might be unfamiliar with the food in America. A collection of Chinese films were bought on video for them, and each one of them was given a season pass to Disney World. As the project neared completion, some 400 people were hired to staff the park, with 180 of those being from China, filling in roles mainly as cooks for the park's restaurants and as performers for the shows. On December 18th, 1993, the park would host a private opening ceremony attended by 2,400 guests, including senior members from the Chinese government. Former US President Richard Nixon even accepted an invitation, although he would later cancel. And the following day, on December 19th, exactly 2 years after construction began, Splendid China would finally open to the public. Entering the park, the first area would be a Main Street-like opening named Suzhou Gardens, with ornate traditional Chinese buildings housing guest services, 2 of the park's 5 dining locations, and numerous gift shops. Seriously, in the entrance area alone, the park had 11 named gift shops marked on its map, with names like Nine Dragon Gifts, Confucius Says, and ancestral artifacts. Here, guests could purchase anything from simple Splendid China t-shirts to cooking utensils, sculptures, jewelry, handmade furniture and hand-painted porcelain, and even souvenirs made from ivory. An office belonging to the CTS was also placed immediately on the left of the main entrance, offering guests the ability to book tours to China to see the real versions of the exhibits. And on the right-hand side, they could enter Harmony Hall, a theatre playing a movie showing an overview of the park and a brief history of its construction. Leaving Suzhou Gardens, guests would encounter the first of the park's miniatures. Directly in front of them would be the Stone Forest. Towering over guests, these were 25-foot tall rock spires and a waterfall emptying into a small lake. A still pretty massive recreation of the 200-million-year-old limestone formations in Yunnan province. Around the edge of the lake, built into an artificial hillside, would be several of China's cliffside carvings, the largest being the Lushan Grand Buddha, another of the park's tallest creations, sitting at 35 feet. Additional carvings like the Dazu reclining Buddha and the ones in Yonggang Grosso were recreated in this area too. But it would really only be once guests carried on past the stone forest that the main part of Splendid China would unfold. The majority of the park's scale models would be housed in a square parcel of land with pathways winding in and around the numerous buildings. Places like the Summer Palace in Beijing sat on its own lake just like the real thing, the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum, the Yellow Crane Tower, and the Marco Polo Bridge, all populated with figurines accurate to the eras they were built. The park was absolutely dense with model landmarks, too many to describe each individual one, but it's important to highlight some of the most significant. The half-mile long model of the Great Wall would begin its winding route across the width of the park from the start of this main area. Below the wall, figurines of workers would haul building materials, and on the other side, Mongolian yurts sat next to the mausoleum of Genghis Khan. Another important site guests could encounter was the Temple of Heaven. Funnily enough, not the only Temple of Heaven in Florida, or even within a 5-mile radius, as the same landmark had been recreated 11 years earlier for the China Pavilion at Disney World's Epcot Center. Another artificial hill would disguise the underground terracotta warriors. The southern end of the park held a number of recreations of China's natural scenery, like the sites along the Lijiang, a river running through southern China, but also in the very corner, the imposing Potala Palace, lofting over the rest of the models from its own hill, and with more figurines at its foot, some animated to show the unraveling of the palace's massive tapestry of the Buddha. But the centerpiece of the park was the Imperial Palace in Beijing, more commonly known as the Forbidden City, a model with one of the largest footprints in the park, containing a scene of an emperor's wedding. Beyond the massive collection of model buildings, guests could also visit the Temple of Light Theatre to watch performances from dancers, musicians, and acrobats. Kids could also visit the Panda Playground, and next to it would be a staple of many small theme parks in the 90s, a singing animatronic show, manufactured by Sally Corporation, named Ye Ye and the Little Airplane Band. Ye Ye is Chinese for grandpa, and the show featured a grandpa panda telling stories from Chinese folklore to his panda cub grandchildren, interjected by members of the band playing songs. The show would run a number of performances of around 8 minutes each, playing on a loop throughout the day. Lastly, at night, the park would host its own fireworks show, and throughout the year, various seasonal events would take place, like one for the Mid-Autumn Moon Festival and a Christmas celebration. Splendid China's exhibits were remarkable for a brand new player in Central Florida's theme park industry. For a park that contained no rides, it was also pretty large, smaller than MGM Studios, but not by much. And as I said earlier, it was completely packed full of the different models. I touched on this briefly when I talked about the Pyongyang Folklore Park in my video on North Korean theme parks, but I'm a big fan of scale models, so I'm definitely more easily impressed by this sort of thing. But these buildings really did look like impressive works of art, and it was this detail and artistry that the park hoped would bring in the tourists. It presented itself to the public as an educational exhibit, an outdoor museum introducing an American audience to the history and customs of a nation that was still a mystery to many of them. But it was this attempt at a history lesson that was one of many reasons why Splendid China also brought with it a massive amount of controversy. From before it had even opened to the public, Splendid China was being heavily criticised due to the alleged involvement of the Chinese government. It was accepted by most journalists at the time that the CTS was a state-owned company, at least partially owned by the Chinese government, and critics claimed that the park wasn't an honest attempt to celebrate Chinese culture, but instead just thinly veiled government propaganda, an insidious attempt by a foreign actor to change public opinion under the guise of a fun day out. The most prominent opposition came from a group named Citizens Against Communist Chinese Propaganda, a collection of members of Florida's Tibetan community and others sympathetic to the cause. They claimed Splendid China was just a ploy by the Chinese government to make Americans more sympathetic to China and to cover up China's oppression of minority groups. One of the things they were protesting was the large Potala Palace, an iconic landmark of Tibet, the home of the Dalai Lama since 1645, and a place the current Dalai Lama was exiled from in 1959, after the annexation of Tibet by China earlier that decade. A very controversial part of modern Chinese and Tibetan history, and a place that Tibetan historians have claimed was ransacked after its capture during the annexation. They also opposed the inclusion of landmarks from East Turkestan and the mausoleum of Genghis Khan and the Mongolian yurts from Inner Mongolia. They said that the inclusion of religious sites was especially inappropriate given that China had no freedom to practice religion, and that the park was attempting to rewrite their history to make these places seem like they had nothing to do with those minority groups and were simply just another part of Chinese culture. The park did respond to these claims. denying allegations of a political motive, with a spokesman saying, "This is not a political park, this is a cultural park." The CTS themselves also denied their government links, despite the widespread reporting, with their vice chairman saying their only connection was that the company was a registered business in Hong Kong. When opening day arrived, the group picketed outside the front entrance, something they did regularly throughout its operation. The protesters were also prolific in the media, writing into newspapers and TV stations. In fact, most reports from opening include large sections dedicated to the protests. And the park didn't do itself any favours when it came to the criticism of it being a suspicious foreign actor either. Just 1 week before Splendid China was scheduled to open, the CTS had actually bought out George Chen and his family from the project, opting to run the park entirely by themselves. As Chen put it, speaking to the conservative magazine The American Spectator in 1999, "It was clear our Chinese government partners preferred to have absolute control. They didn't want me around on opening day." He had felt further friction with his government partners throughout the park's development. During construction, he had pushed back against what he saw as unusual spending decisions by the CTS. In that same article, he recalled instances where they wanted to import wooden beams from China for $80 each, when the same type of wood could be sourced locally for $5, or when they wanted to buy concrete dye. Yes, the park did have coloured concrete, that newspaper lied, for $75 a gallon, when the equivalent amount of US dye would cost 30 cents. Something he suspected was being done so members of the CTS could receive some kind of kickback. He felt that the CTS were increasingly trying to micromanage the park, and he certainly caused conflict with them when, just before the buyout, he told local media that he welcomed the protesters. He added further evidence to the claims of whitewashing history, speaking about the CTS's desire to reconstruct the smashed faces of some of the statues in the park's Longmen Grotto, which had been vandalized in real life by the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. And he even claimed that during the initial hiring process, the FBI had become concerned that the construction workers might have been brought over to spy on Cape Canaveral. Amid the claims of foreign propaganda, and with regular protesters out front, Splendid China still attempted to draw in the tourist crowds in 1994. It produced a promotional VHS, and encouraged schools to tour on history trips. In its first year, initial hopes were that the park would welcome 1 million visitors, fewer people than its sister park in Shenzhen, but still a sizable amount. But by February, only 2 months after it had opened, attendance was down to only 1,500 guests a day, half of what it would need to meet its targets. Part of the problem, beyond protests and claims of its political motives, was that the park failed to advertise itself enough to tourists. It did increase its marketing budget later in the 90s, but particularly in those early years, many people were unaware it even existed. While it may have been close to Disney World from a pure distance standpoint, it was relatively out of the way compared to many other theme parks at the time, like SeaWorld and Universal. Not technically within the Orlando area where most parks were, but within the bounds of the city of Kissimmee. And by the 90s, Orlando theme parks were well into a flashier, higher budget era of exciting rides and attractions, and the quieter historical park was just not interesting enough for the area. Tickets were pretty expensive for what it was, $23.55 at opening, which, considering a ticket to the much more popular Magic Kingdom cost $35, was just too high for a clearly lesser experience. As the 90s went on, attendance continued to slip, and Splendid China experienced further protests and other issues that exacerbated its controversial status, like the loss of dozens of performers who fled the park seeking political asylum in the United States, alleging they were being held against their will. In 1995, schools in Pinellas County on Florida's west coast were banned from taking trips to the park. In 1996, a reorganization and rebrand was attempted, bringing in a new president from the CTS and implementing an aggressive TV advertising campaign. Suzhou Gardens would be renamed to Chinatown, now free to enter, and the hope was that guests could then be convinced to pay to visit the miniatures deeper into the park. Later that year, the park was visited by then Disney CEO Michael Eisner, and rumors started flying that Disney were planning to purchase it, perhaps, as the Orlando Business Journal suggested, to improve relations with the Chinese government in the hopes of one day building a theme park there. Or maybe just to seek the CTS's help in acquiring a panda for the upcoming Animal Kingdom. Splendid China's struggles would only get worse. Faced with financial difficulties from the poor attendance, parts of the park fell into disrepair. By the year 2000, only 200 guests were visiting a day, and it was reportedly losing $9 million a year. Ticket prices were cut to below what they had cost in 1993, and while not officially confirmed, it was reported that a deal had been reached to sell the park to a Massachusetts-based company for just over $50 million, only slightly above half of what it had cost to build in the first place. This deal never went through, and later that year, the new president was sent back to China by the CTS, reportedly for mismanaging funds during his only 4 years in charge. Further allegations were made by the park's American PR manager that president had purposefully allowed Splendid China to look bad so he could force a sale he would profit from. With another new president, an attempt was made to continue into the 21st century, but finally in 2003, the limit had been reached, and that year, it was announced that Splendid China would permanently close. On its final day, on New Year's Eve 2003, the park would welcome around 750 guests, more than 3 times its typical daily attendance. Several of the exhibits were covered in dirt, and speakers that played pre-recorded narration weren't working properly. A sorry end to its 10 years of operation. The park sat vacant throughout 2004, until December 11th, when it was open to the public for an auction of various statues, figurines, and smaller items. The Great Wall was broken into parts and sold to collectors, and around this time, the animatronic band was removed from their theatre. Unfortunately, during the year it was empty, it had already been repeatedly broken into and vandalized. And while some items were able to be sold intact, several of the exhibits had been smashed up, particularly in the Forbidden City, where most of the miniatures in the wedding scene had been crushed and broken into small pieces. Ceramics scattered at the foot of the Imperial Palace. Included in the auction were koi that had lived in a pond in the Chinatown area, as it was drained in preparation for a longer-term closure of the site. Even if you weren't interested in buying anything, the auction provided one final chance for the public to get a glimpse inside what was left of the park, at least legally. In 2005, the site was sold to a developer, but nothing was really done to turn it into anything new, and it sat, now effectively abandoned. It did have security guards who would occasionally patrol the area, but nowhere near frequently enough to deter the many urban explorers now eager to get a look inside the decaying miniature country. Urban exploration happened immediately, and photos and videos gradually emerged online of the state the park was in. The smaller exhibits were now gone, but many of the larger ones were too big to remove easily, so places like the Potala Palace and the Forbidden City were left behind, as were the human-sized buildings once housing the theatres, shops, and restaurants, with overgrowth slowly enveloping them, swallowing up the segments of the Great Wall that hadn't been sold. Even to those who didn't want to risk trespassing on the site, elements like the Potala Palace were so big they could be seen from beyond the large wall that surrounded the property. Alongside people who simply wanted to look around, Splendid China also became a hotspot for further vandalism, and graffiti covered many of the structures. During the late 2000s, police were called to nearly 100 incidents of trespassers on the site. Firefighters were also called in 2007 when a fire broke out, apparently started by vandals. The unusual backdrop of ornate Chinese architecture falling apart in Central Florida also drew the attention of skateboarders. Several groups of skateboarders used the park, riding over the Imperial Palace and inside the old theatre. In 2008, the skate video Last of the Mohicans featured clips of Splendid China, as did a number of other videos uploaded to YouTube around the same time, many of which showed areas not typically as well documented by the urban explorers. In fact, the drop down from the Longmen Grotto Buddhas became a local skate spot in its own right, known as the Buddha Gap. In 2009, 6 teenagers were arrested after being discovered near the scene of another fire, this time in the Harmony Hall movie theatre. Shortly after this incident, the property was put up for sale again for $30 million. Urban exploring, vandalism, and skateboarding continued into the 2010s. But finally, in 2013, under new ownership, and after an abandonment that lasted just as long as its operation, Splendid China's demolition began. The remaining miniatures were torn up, including the long controversial Potala Palace, and aside from an old restaurant building, the only things that remained were the pathways, winding through footprints of former exhibits. In 2016, the pathways were completely cleared as construction began on a new project, the Margaritaville Resort Orlando, a 300-acre resort featuring a new shopping center, hotel, and water park, with the Margaritaville cottages taking the place of the old Splendid China site. The Margaritaville Resort officially opened in January 2019. The entrance to the cottages sits in the exact spot the old Splendid China entrance was, and the resort's perimeter wall was carried over from the park, just with its Chinese theming changed to match the new design. For many years, there was also one other reminder of Splendid China, which was a shopping plaza in Formosa Gardens, themed inside and out in a similar Chinese style. However, in 2024, this shopping plaza was heavily refurbished, losing its themed look, and with it, any remnants of the old, controversial theme park just outside of Disney World disappeared. Okay, so there actually is an extra detail about the fate of the park's attractions that I wanted to include. Remember Yay Yay and the Little Airplane Band? Well, a few years ago, a video was uploaded to YouTube by someone showing they had come into possession of the Monkey King animatronic. His hands were in poor condition, and some of his facial movements were malfunctioning, but with all things considered, the animatronic was still in pretty decent working order. I got in touch with Kevin, the owner of the animatronic, and he told me that he still owns the Monkey King, and his movements have now been fully restored. But that as far as he's aware, as of the recording of this video, the locations of the other animatronics from the show are still unknown. Splendid China's failure to draw a crowd, in my opinion, was primarily the fault of management that just weren't prepared for how differently they had to operate a park in America than in China. So many of the stories, the park's attempts at minimal early marketing, and a heavy focus on slower educational attractions paint a picture of a company that really didn't understand how to play the game in Orlando. I get the impression they believed simply spending a lot of money on construction and being close to Disney World were all that it would take to draw in visitors. But in a rapidly saturating market, there were just so many far more exciting, interesting places for people to spend a day. To put it simply, it was just too boring. I also think it could have done much better if it was built anywhere else in the country other than Orlando. Because again, with just so many other parks, while the perception the CTS might have had was that it was the prime location to capture as many tourists as possible, it also meant the standard of competition was just that much higher as well. And lastly, on the competition side of things, Central Florida already had a Chinese theme park of a sort, in that, as I mentioned earlier, Epcot's China Pavilion had been around since 1982, featuring a lot of the same elements, but in a park that also had rides. In fact, the film guests could see in the Harmony Theatre was incredibly similar to the Wonders of China Circle Vision film that played for guests over at Epcot. So while the CTS might have seen it as a unique experience for the area, it actually wasn't as different from existing offerings as they thought. The closure was seen as a victory for the Tibetan activist group, whose protests had continued regularly throughout Splendid China's entire lifespan. Of course, this too is a huge problem the park had, and it should not be overlooked. I'm sure the protests and the constant press coverage about controversy and propaganda did keep tourists away. However, as big a story as that was, it's clear when taking a closer look that the simpler theme park management decisions had a lot more to do with its poor attendance than the park's political undertones ever did. The original park in Shenzhen still exists, a place that never had to deal with the same controversies or unfamiliar market, and still receives frequent visitors. I've known about Splendid China for a little while now, but it was only when I really looked into it that I discovered just how deep this story is, and it's something that I find fascinating. The story of an accused propaganda park by a foreign government showing up just outside of Disney World and then being propped up for a decade to declining visitors is fascinating enough in itself. But when you add on how beautifully designed and detailed the place was, and then also its decade of abandonment, I'm surprised this park doesn't hold a bigger spot in the world of abandoned theme park stories. Did you ever visit Splendid China? And even if you didn't, what are your thoughts on the park? Its backstory, its management, or just its exhibits? Let me know in the comments. Other than that, if you're not already, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are always more theme park videos coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.